Good afternoon, and thank you for your interest in this symposium. My name is Lucía, and I'm going to present our work about qualitative and quantitative evidence of meta-dehumanization among Moroccan immigrants in Spain, a work developed with my colleagues, Alexandra Vázquez, Erika Vázquez, Beatriz González, and Andrea Constantin. This work is part of a wider project funded by the Ministry of Science, Innovation, and University of Spain about new proposals for the improvement of intergroup relations. We are aware that dehumanization, viewed as the process that reduces human beings to the level of non-human animals or machines, and by denying them a sense of dignity, is central to understand intergroup conflicts. Meta-dehumanization, the perception that one's group has been given less than human qualities, also plays an important role in the spiral of intergroup conflict and the reinforcement of intercultural misunderstanding. Research has shown that those who think that another group dehumanizes their own group are more likely to dehumanize that group in return. More recently, Bruno and colleagues have shown evidences that contact quality can reduce meta-dehumanization. However, studies rarely have explored the meta-dehumanization of the ethnic minorities. Muslims are among the social groups that experienced a deeper discrimination in Europe. In Spain, most non-European immigrants come from Morocco, a country with Islam as official religion. Moroccans are perceived as less moral and more threatening than other immigrant groups and reported the highest perceived discrimination in Spain. The present work aimed at understanding if Moroccans living in Spain feel they are dehumanized by Spanish people and how the meta-dehumanization experiences are related to other psychosocial variables. We decided to use mixed methods, combining the naturalist and inductive logic of qualitative research with the systematic and deductive logic of quantitative research. We followed an exploratory design, starting with a qualitative phase with 4 discussion groups with Moroccan women and men. Then we developed a questionnaire based on the qualitative results and to test them hypotheses quantitatively. Then we collected data from a major sample of Moroccan immigrants through a survey. Finally, we interpreted both sources of data to arrive to certain conclusions. In the qualitative phase, we conducted 4 different discussion groups with 2 with women and 2 with men of Moroccan origin, following criteria of homogeneity and heterogeneity as shown in the table. The discussion groups with women were moderated by a Spanish woman in Spanish, whereas the discussion groups with men were moderated by a Moroccan man in Arabic because of their level of proficiency in Spanish. We explored 3 thematic themes across 2 dimensions of intergroup interactions and meta-perception through indirect questions, with special caution of not leading the discourse of the participants. The themes of work, religion, and family, as well as the categories of intergroup interactions and meta-perceptions, were pre-established and followed a deductive analysis. However, the rest of the analysis approach and were extracted inductive categories that emerged from the speech of the participants. Referring to intergroup interactions, participants talked about both negative and positive interactions, perceived discrimination, especially at work, but also references to absence of discrimination. Regarding their meta-perception, participants spontaneously expressed a negative meta-perception, considering that the Spanish people see them as immoral, incompetent, threatening, and even dehumanize them. These perceptions were accompanied by a positive meta-perception of competence. They feel simultaneously verified and not verified under the gaze of the Spanish. We found interesting that the discussion groups of women talked more about discrimination at work and religious discrimination, and also more, they told more experiences of negative contact than the group of men. Here we will focus in the examples of meta-dehumanization. Men consider that there is always racism, and the bosses always see them as third world men, ignorant, and that what brings them to Spain is hunger. They consider that bosses are especially racist and treat them badly, like animals. Linked to the exploitation feelings, they consider that the Spanish people see them as tractors, like human machines or donkeys. This vision is shared by Moroccan women. They consider that the Spanish people think they are slaves and work like donkeys or machines. They lament about the feeling of being considered inferior and come to claim, we are not animals, we are people too. We also found an interesting discourse about how they think they are considered dirty people, and this is used as the justification for not renting them a house. We consider this discourse linked to the meta-dehumanization because it entails denying them a sense of dignity. Based on these findings, we developed a questionnaire to directly analyze the feelings and perception that Moroccans had shown in the discussion groups. The quantitative phase had 5 specific objectives: to analyze meta-dehumanization, to compare meta-dehumanization with meta-prejudice, to compare meta-dehumanization between Moroccan women and men, to analyze the relation of meta-dehumanization with other psychosocial variables, and to analyze the contribution of meta-dehumanization to anger and indignation. Through a survey that could be filled online or in paper and pencil, in Arabic or in Spanish, 180 Moroccan origin people participated. The data collection was quite difficult. 6 participants did not report their sex and were discarded. Men and women were around 30 years old, but the mean age for men was higher. The mean time of residence in Spain was around 15 years. Moroccan participants reported their level of identification with Morocco and Spain, their meta-dehumanization based on 3 items directly extracted from the discussion groups. The Spanish sees us as animals, machines, and think we are dirty. They also reported to what extent they thought that the Spanish people had negative attitudes towards Moroccan immigrants, perceived discrimination regarding their working conditions, renting houses, and in shops, their perceived situation of Moroccan immigrants in Spain, and their feelings of pity, indignation, and anger about such situation. Their willingness to participate in collective actions for the rights of Moroccan immigrants, their quantity and quality of contact with the Spanish people, and other socio-demographics, such as subjective socioeconomic status. Results showed that their meta-prejudice was significantly higher than their level of meta-dehumanization. Perception of meta-dehumanization were moderated in women, but lower in men. In general, women expressed not only more meta-dehumanization, but more meta-prejudice, more perceived discrimination, considered the situation of Moroccans in Spain worse, and felt more pity, indignation, and anger about such situation compared to men. The correlations among variables show that the higher socioeconomic status, Spanish identification, contact quality with the Spanish people, and perceived quality of in-group life, the less meta-dehumanization. On the contrary, perceived discrimination was positively associated with both higher meta-dehumanization and meta-prejudice, but the relation with meta-dehumanization was stronger. Both meta-dehumanization and meta-prejudice were positively associated to pity, indignation, and anger about the situation of Moroccans in Spain. We explored in more detail the association with these emotions. Indignation and anger are two powerful emotions related to feelings of aggravation. To analyze the contribution of meta-dehumanization to anger and indignation towards the situation of Moroccans in Spain, we conducted a hierarchical regression with sociodemographics of sex, age, subjective socioeconomic status, and time living in Spain in the first step, and the rest of psychosocial variables in the second step. As we can see, meta-dehumanization and meta-prejudice were the unique predictor in the model of feelings of indignation and anger. And meta-dehumanization was the unique predictor of anger toward the situation of Moroccans in Spain. Despite its limitations, these studies revealed a severe and alarming feeling of meta-dehumanization that emerged inductively in the discussion groups. Also, the existence of gender differences, with women expressing more meta-dehumanization, meta-prejudice, which is related to their higher perceived discrimination. In the discussion groups, religious discrimination due to the hijab and even sexual harassment at work emerged. The intersectionality of being women, and Moroccan can account for these findings, but we should explore more deeply these feelings in future studies. We also found a substantial relations of meta-dehumanization with perceived discrimination and with powerful emotions like indignation and anger. These emotions related to feelings of aggravation can have negative consequences. Additionally, meta-dehumanization might prevent Spanish identification of Moroccan people. These findings urge for interventions to act on these feelings and to improve intercultural relations and to pursue a more inclusive society. I hope these findings may be of interest of you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, my name is Trevor James at Newcastle University, and this is a joint presentation with my colleague Rebecca Smith at the University of Greenwich. And our presentation is on homeless people, and really it's about how many people have prejudice towards homeless people, and how that might be because they see homeless people as being all the same. So we're really interested in this. We're going to refer to this throughout as outgroup homogeneity, which is really the extent to which we see outgroup members as being all the same. And this is somewhat practical, somewhat conceptual data, really looking at all these things together. outgroup homogeneity, dehumanization, prejudice in one sort of set of studies. All right, I'll just pass you over to my colleague, Rebecca Smith.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Just to illustrate our point here, the reason we selected homeless people to look at in terms of dehumanization is illustrated by this picture. So this is used by a charity called St Mungo's, a homeless charity in the UK, really drawing on the idea that perhaps we are valuing the dog's well-being more highly than we do the homeless person. And there is also research evidence to suggest that homeless people face particularly extreme forms of prejudice. And that's illustrated here. So this graph shows how this idea of them being the lowest of the low, they're in the low quadrant. So they're seen as both low in warmth and low in competence in terms of the stereotype content model, which Trevor's going to explain.
Yeah, so the stereotype content model is, I'm actually not going to say much about it because I think this is quite a famous model. I think probably everyone listening to this talk is aware of it, but really it takes a more, I guess, cognitive sort of neuroscience approach, which looks at lack of activation in certain areas of the brain, which might then explain prejudice and dehumanization towards certain groups. So we wanted to certainly include the stereotype content model when we were thinking about dehumanization of homeless people. But there are a couple of other models as well, which I think are also interesting. Imprehumanization is another classic model, which I think most people are going to be very much familiar with. And really, again, I'm not going to explain it very much at all, but it's really about how we ascribe secondary emotions, more complex, subtle emotions towards outgroup members, and how we tend to do that much more so for in-group members. The third model, which we were focused on, is by Haslam. This is the dual model of dehumanization. It's very similar to infrahumanization. I wouldn't say that it competes with those theories, but it's more that it takes a slightly different view of dehumanization and splits it into two sorts of flavors. You've got human nature, which is really what distinguishes us from from machines and makes us alive. And then you've got human uniqueness, which is more unique to what makes humans different from other types of animals. So we've got those three main approaches. And one of the interesting things about those approaches is that they all offer similar, if slightly different, conceptualizations of dehumanization. Now, in this couple of studies that we're going to talk about, we take the position that dehumanization is fundamentally related to our cognitions and also fundamentally related to group categorization as a process. So we dehumanize because of the way that we see groups as being different from us, a sort of self-other difference. And what we thought was, if that's true, if dehumanization is fundamentally linked to group categorizations, then the degree to which we see outgroup members as all the same or all different, in other words, the degree to which we think that they're homogenous or not, may predict prejudiced attitudes towards that group. So if we see homeless people as all the same, then we're more likely to be prejudiced towards homeless people. Now, there are a few studies that we managed to find that have looked at this, but not many. Brower and Arafi in 2011, they found that racial prejudice towards Moroccan, Chinese, and Arabs could be predicted by perceived outgroup homogeneity. And that was also shown by Chen and Ratliff in 2015. They looked at white to black prejudice. I think that one was more correlational, whereas Brower was experimental. In addition to that, there's also some research which suggests that our perceptions of outgroup homogeneity really start from a very early age. So Shiro et al. Found that children generally found outgroups to be more homogeneous compared to in-groups, and Nazy et al. Found that children requested more category information, in other words, less individual information about outgroups compared to in-groups. So if we put this all together, effectively what we're suggesting here is that outgroup homogeneity may be linked with dehumanization, and that we might find there's a link between outgroup homogeneity and prejudice. And that takes us to this conceptual model where we're saying outgroup homogeneity will lead to these sort of negative attitudes or prejudice, but in itself, outgroup homogeneity could be explained by dehumanization. Now, this is, you could look at this in a few different ways. The reason why we chose this sort of structure rather than sort of shuffling it around a bit, well, there's a couple of reasons, but one is because we really wanted to test whether these different models of dehumanization could explain the relationship between outgroup homogeneity and prejudice. So that's one reason we've taken this model. And also, we think that outgroup homogeneity will lead to negative attitudes towards the homeless, primarily, of course, because we already have lots of negative stereotypes towards the homeless. So if you have those negative stereotypes, and you think that homeless people are all the same, that could then explain prejudice.
Thanks, Trevor. So our first study, which is correlational, we tested those three different types of measurements of dehumanization. So we had the infrahumanization scale, we had the dual model of dehumanization, so that's testing Haslam's model, and we had a measure of the stereotype content model. Now, each of our three dehumanization scales had good reliability, but I do need to draw your attention to our outgroup homogeneity measure, which didn't have particularly strong. It was, yeah, well, 6.3. It was what it was. So those were our key predictive measures, and our outcome measures were discussed, pro-social intentions, and prejudice scale. Excuse me. And our findings were that outgroup homogeneity, dual process model, so Haslam, and the stereotype content model predicted prejudice towards homeless people. The infrahumanization measurement wasn't a significant predictor, which is quite surprising, and particularly with outgroup homogeneity, it seems to be the most linked to the idea of lack of complexity or lack of variety, but it didn't come out. Outgroup homogeneity in the dual process model predicted disgust towards homeless people. Again, another surprising effect, because disgust is the outcome that we would most strongly associate with stereotype content model. So yeah, with warmth and competency as predictors. Excuse me. But the stereotype content model measurement that we used there did predict pro-sociality. So it did predict the positive reactions to homeless people. The dual model also predicted outgroup homogeneity effects. Okay, so we used model 4 to look at that sort of double mediation. And our finding, so the model significantly mediated the relationship between outgroup homogeneity and prejudice, and between outgroup homogeneity and disgust. So it's in the lead at this point. So in our second study, we were interested in replicating elements of this first study. We focused on the dual model, Haslam's model, and the stereotype content model, and dropped the Layens infrahumanization because it wasn't significant. So we're focusing on those two. We also wanted this time to look at an experimental approach. So rather than measuring, we manipulated outgroup homogeneity. And that was across 3 conditions of homogeneous, heterogeneous, and control. We predicted that when the homeless people are depicted as very similar, dehumanization would be higher, as will the negative attitudes. And that was a pre-registered study. Now, we use our 3 conditions prime were adverts for homeless people. It's presented as a charity, and I'll show you in a second. We purposefully kept them quite abstract. So rather than our slides where we have got homogenous stereotyped pictures here of the homeless, I'll show you in a second, we kept them quite abstract to avoid introducing those kind of confounds. We also wanted to introduce attitudes towards policy. So this is where Trevor mentioned at the beginning, the idea of having a practical applied edge to our research. We were interested in doing that. So we were interested in whether or not these attitudes drive people's attitudes towards policy. So here's what I mean by them being quite abstract. We were very controlled. So other than the letters in red and the second paragraph where we're looking at the amount of variability, this is our heterogeneous condition. So we can see here we're saying that the homeless people don't have much in common. So we're priming heterogeny. We're also saying that there's a great amount of variability, wide range of people are affected. If we move to the second slide, you can see that that's really the only difference. So the rest of it is that people don't understand the issue, and the argument is that they all face the same sort of challenges. There's limited variability. And this is our control condition. It's just about reading for pleasure. Okay. Now, the results showed that, unfortunately, whilst the outgroup homogeneity manipulation did seem to work in a very limited way, so perceived outgroup homogeneity was much higher. So they were seen as more homogeneous when we tried to manipulate them to be more homogeneous. So that was significant at 0.002. Which is good as a manipulation check, but we didn't have any other significant effects. So that manipulation didn't then go on to affect our dehumanization measures or prejudice or anything else. What you can see here is the correlational results that we've got. With the exception of willingness to donate, you can see everything else is significantly related, significantly correlated, and in the direction that we would predict. Okay, so the policy was phrased in a positive way, so we would expect negative correlations here. Okay.
Oh, I'm doing this one. Yeah, so we've obviously one of the things we want to do is replicate the study 1 findings, particularly some of the weird results where we found Haslam's model predicted disgust better than SEM, which we weren't expecting. So we conducted some more mediations again. We've put this on one conceptual diagram, but this is basically model 4, just with 2 mediators, in the Hayes process. So it's just normal serial mediation. We can see that the so outgroup homogeneity was a significant predictor of prejudice, and significantly predicted both the SEM and the dual model. And both the dual model and the SEM also significantly predicted prejudice. In terms of mediation, we can see that they were also both significant mediators as well. So the SEM model was actually did better in this study 2, compared to study 1. And Haslam model again is quite consistently acting as a mediator. There was, however, still this result which we can't explain, where the dual model still predicted and mediated the relationship between outgroup homogeneity and disgust. So we did replicate that mediation effect in study 2. Okay, conclusion.
Thank you. So yeah, just to give you a quick overview of the 2 together. yeah, overall, study 2 did replicate our findings. So as Trevor says, it replicated the slightly surprising effect on disgust. In each of our studies, it's the dual model that's the bigger mediator. So yeah, I think we're pushed for time, so I'll perhaps move on. So that we have got a few limitations. So it was conducted online during COVID. Some of the limitations may be to do with our scale. So yeah, we can discuss this more.
So this is all very much work in progress, but it is interesting because there are very few studies that have really looked at the main approaches that we have in psychology at the moment to explain dehumanization, and actually sort of pitted them against each other and sort of seeing which one is the most explanatory. It's also interesting, of course, to see which models and approaches to dehumanization explain which outcomes. It's also very interesting, I think, to think about outgroup homogeneity, because very few studies have looked at the link between just seeing outgroup members as all the same or seeing outgroup members as all being different, and how that might actually explain prejudice. And of course, we've done that with the mediation as well. It does raise further questions, though. There is generally, I think, some criticism of dehumanization as a field. Harriet Over, I'm sure you're probably aware of this if you're at this conference, but Harriet Over was quite critical of dehumanization, and especially in terms of the way dehumanization is conceptualized. And is it really dehumanization, or is it more derogation? And so there was a whole special issue on that. And I think looking at things like outgroup homogeneity, thinking about dehumanization more in a process sense can help to maybe move in the right direction, or at least maybe start to think about and address some of those criticisms. And it's also, I think, consistent as well with Tan and Harris' recent sort of conceptual paper on why homeless people are so dehumanized as well. And I'm not going to try and explain all of that, given that Harris Lozano is here and can explain that much better than I do. But there are a few different levels you can look at dehumanization and dehumanization of homeless in a few different approaches. And I think it does somewhat fit with that. In a sense, what we're arguing is that there may be a link between these sort of neurological functions and lack of activation, and how that then leads to outgroup homogeneity, and how that might then further explain dehumanization. That's it. I think we've reached the end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm very happy to be part of this interesting, important meeting celebrating research on dehumanization, to which I have dedicated most of my academic career. Now I will share with you the latest studies I've conducted on acknowledgement of humanity to a specific target group, migrants, considering both factors that can help attribution of humanity or can hinder it. We know that that of migrants is a not issue for society, and I wanted to know whether it is possible to challenge the dehumanization of migrants and promote their inclusion in society. We know that humanity is the most important good to be acknowledged to one another. So in this contribution, we focused on two kind of different measures of dehumanization, considering language as the tool through which stereotypes are communicated and maintained, and attribution of human rights as an explicit political measure of acknowledgement of human deservingness to migrants. We consider beneficial factors that can help promotion and attribution of humanity to migrants. Drawing from previous literature, we know that adolescents use of multiple categorization to define migrants reduces prejudice toward migrants and increases identification with the human group. And we also know that identification with the human group mediates the effects of social identification with close groups for adolescents like classmates and friends in predicting their social well-being, so the extent to which they feel they can play an active role in their society. So identification with the human group can have several beneficial outcomes. And we wanted to know in study 1 whether linguistic description of migrants can be predicted by the use of multiple categorization and identification with the human group, and then become more inclusive, linguistically inclusive. In the second study, we focus both on constraints, beneficial factors that can promote attribution of humanity, and as factors that might mediate the detrimental effects of other factors. And we focus on attribution of human rights, considering identification with the human group, which we know has several positive effects on, for instance, reduction of prejudice, attribution of human rights, greater concern for human rights and global crisis. But we also, drawing from research on personal identity formation in adolescence, we also focused on another factor that can play an important role, that is in-depth exploration of educational alternatives or educational choices. This is a core feature of the information-oriented identity style, through which people actively seek and process relevant information in order to make accurate and thoughtful decisions about their education choices, in contrast to superficial information processing. So this maybe can challenge the effects of reliance on categorical thinking, leading to greater openness to others, and reduction of use of categorization to divide the social world. So we expected that these factors can hinder the detrimental factors that we know, the effects of detrimental factors that we know are associated to prejudice, like symbolic and realistic threat that we know enhance prejudice, and the perception of relative deprivation may be derived from activation or intergroup threat. In study 1, we focus on how do adolescents linguistically define migrants, and this is part of a larger longitudinal study that we have been conducting, and so we measure at T1 and time 1 the extent to which adolescents use multiple categorization to define migrants by choosing, by rating the extent to which for definition of migrants which were formulated in terms of multiple belongingness were suitable to define migrants. So we measured the use of multiple categorization instead of manipulating it. And we also measured identification with the human group at T1. Then at T2, a year and a half later, we asked participants to freely describe with their own words the outgroup of migrants, the group of migrants, and the linguistic production that we got were coded by 2 independent judges. In terms relying on the self-categorization theory by Turner and colleagues, so in terms of individualizing terms based on personal categorization, or categorical terms based on outgroup categorization, or human terms based on human categorization. And we wanted to know whether participants who employed multiple categorization to a extent to define migrants at T1 would also use more inclusive terms at T2, that is individualizing terms based on the personal level of other categorization, or human terms relying on human categorization rather than terms stressing outgroup belongingness, so terms relying on social categorization. And we also expected that participants with high levels of identification with the human group at T1 would use at T2 individualizing terms or human terms to a higher extent than categorical terms stressing outgroup belongingness. We conducted two-step clustering in order to classify participants depending on their use of individualizing categorical and human terms, and we got 3 clusters. The cluster of participants who mainly use individualizing terms, that of participants who mainly use the term referring to our category, and the cluster of participants who mainly use human terms, like they are human beings. This is a less numerous cluster of participants, but in this cluster we have people that clearly use human terms to understand the other 2 categories of terms. So we participants in this group have a more polarized use of human terms than in the other groups. And going to the test of the hypothesis, we saw that adolescents with who used multiple categorization to extent at T1 also describe migrants as human beings rather than outgroup members at T2 to a extent. And then that participant with high levels of identification with the human group at T1 also were participants that used individual terms rather than outgroup terms to a extent at T2, and also used human terms rather than categorical terms to a higher extent at T2. So we found the individual differences in cognitive factors, social cognitive factors, such as the extent to which adolescents use multiple categorization to define migrants, or their identification with the human group, affect the way in which they talk about a very stigmatized social outgroup. So multiple categorization, human identification can reduce linguistic discrimination and promote adolescents' linguistic inclusiveness towards outgroupers. In the second set of study, we focus on human rights, attribution of human rights to migrants, and we wanted to know whether the effects of detrimental factors that are often associated to migrants, such as intergroup threat, or the consequential feeling of fraternalistic relative deprivation deriving from threat, that it's also often called into play by politicians, can be mediated by beneficial factors. So we expect that intergroup threat will lead to lesser attribution of human rights to migrants, and that this effect might be mediated by the deriving consequential feeling of fraternalistic relative deprivation by natives. And we consider whether these effects were mediated by potential beneficial factors, such as identification with the human group and in-depth exploration of educational identity, since this is a form of accurately process information, and maybe also it's also linked to a more accurate way of processing of social informations, so going beyond dichotomous in-group outgroup categorization. So we overall expected that in sequence, in-depth exploration and educational identity of educational identity alternatives and identification with the human group would mediate the relation between threat, relative deprivation, and denial of human rights to migrants. So we conducted 2 studies. In study 2A, we manipulated realistic threats in contrast to a no-threat condition using a scenario that we used in previous research. And in study 2B, we manipulated symbolic threats in contrast to no threat. Then we measured fraternalistic relative deprivation and educational in-depth exploration, with items like I think a lot of my education, I am interested in deeply understanding the value of my information. Then also we measured identification with the human group and attribution of human rights to migrants, as we did in previous studies. As regards hypothesis 1, we found that both realistic threat and symbolic threat led to lesser attribution of human rights to migrants, and we also found in both studies that threat also reduced in-depth exploration. So, and going to our mediational hypothesis, in both studies we found a significant indirect effect of in-depth exploration of educational alternatives, human identification, relative deprivation, and on attribution of human rights. So we found, as expected in hypothesis 3, that the effect of threat on reducing attribution of human rights to migrants was mediated by in-depth exploration, which was positively associated with identification with the human group, which was negatively associated with relative deprivation, which in turn was negatively associated with attribution of human rights. We didn't find evidence for the effect that the hypothesis that the effect of threat on attribution of human rights is mediated only by relative deprivation. But in the second study on symbolic threat, we found that the effect of symbolic threat on attribution of human rights was significantly indirectly mediated by in-depth exploration, identification with the human group, which have a direct effect then on attribution of human rights. So also we found another indirect path from threat to through in-depth exploration and human identification with the human group, beside the one that we expected. So hypothesis 3 was confirmed. So these 2 studies show that the detrimental effects of intergroup threat and relative deprivation partially in hindering attribution of humanity to migrants by young adults can be challenged by beneficial factors that are related to their experience of young adults, that is by in-depth exploration. This tendency to thoroughly consider information related to own personal identity can positively affect social cognitive identity processes. For instance, fostering identification with a superordinate human in-group, with all the positive consequences that this can have in disrupting the effects of dichotomous in-group categorization. And we show that by considering the intertwined nature of processes related to personal and social identity, we can highlight additional social cognitive processes like exploration of identity alternatives that can be linked to openness to other and more thorough processing of social information. So looking at adolescence and emerging adulthood, crucial life phases in which we can challenge dehumanization, we can foster social programs strengthening these kind of social cognitive tools that can have beneficial outcomes also on intergroup processes and not only on personal identity processes. So that's all. Thank you very much. I hope you will have interesting suggestions to further improve this research. Thank you.